Managing Azure SQL Managed Identity is a crucial aspect of securing and automating database authentication in Azure. This guide provides a step-by-step approach to understanding and managing Azure SQL Managed Identity. First, it is essential to understand what Azure SQL Managed Identity is. Azure SQL Managed Identity is a feature that allows Azure SQL databases to authenticate to Azure services without needing to manage credentials. This is achieved through the use of managed identities, which are created and managed by Azure. To get started with Azure SQL Managed Identity, you need to enable the Managed Identity feature for your Azure SQL database. This can be done through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or PowerShell. Once enabled, Azure will create a managed identity for your database, which can be used to authenticate to other Azure services. The next step is to configure the managed identity to access other Azure resources. This is done by assigning the necessary permissions to the managed identity. For example, if you want to use the managed identity to access Azure storage, you need to assign the storage contributor role to the managed identity. After configuring the managed identity, you need to connect to Azure SQL database using the managed identity. This can be done using the Azure SQL connection string, which includes the managed identity credentials. You can also use the managed identity to authenticate to other Azure services, such as Azure Key Vault, to retrieve sensitive information like database credentials. Best practices for managing Azure SQL Managed Identity include monitoring and auditing managed identity activity, regularly reviewing and updating managed identity permissions, and using least privilege access to minimize security risks. In summary, managing Azure SQL Managed Identity involves enabling the feature, configuring the managed identity, connecting to Azure SQL database, and following best practices. By following these steps and using Azure SQL Managed Identity, you can simplify database authentication, improve security, and reduce the risk of credential management.